Americans spend surprisingly little time thinking about our economic. I'm going to start over. Americans spend surprisingly little time thinking about our economic system. Capitalism itself is a fait accompli, yet capitalism has as much influence on our day to day lives as any other man made institution. Few of us know how capitalism developed or how dramatically it has changed over time. For most of us, capitalism simply exists as a permanent feature of modern life. But capitalism has a long history, and understanding that history can help us better appreciate contemporary debates about inequality, labor, markets, consumerism, and the role of government in the economy. To help us explore these issues, I am pleased to welcome Professor Larry Glickman of Cornell University. Professor Glickman is a leading historian of American capitalism. His work examines consumer culture, economic thought, political movements, and the changing relationship between citizens, markets, and government. His book, Free Enterprise in American History, places contemporary economic debates in a broader historical context, reminding us that many of the assumptions we take for granted today were once fiercely contested. Hello, I am Marvin King, and this is Civic Lens. Larry, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So my first question is this, or really it's more of a comment. And my question, I guess, is how would a historian respond to this assumption? And the assumption is many people might assume capitalism is simply the natural way economies function. So as a historian, how do you respond to that?
It's funny that you say that because I just finished teaching history of capitalism with my colleague Ed Baptist. And in the first lecture, we said, we don't care if you come out of this course loving capitalism or hating capitalism or being indifferent about capitalism. The main lesson we want to teach you is that capitalism is historical, that it is not natural, and that it has changed over time. It has meant different things over time. And this is a process that historians call denaturalizing, which is when you take things that people think to be natural, but then when you look at history, you say people didn't always think this way or look at it this way. In fact, in the second lecture of the class, I give that lecture, and it's called How Capitalism Got Its Name. And it's about how until the late 19th century, most Americans sort of rejected the label capitalists. Even people we would think would be capitalists would say, I don't really consider myself a capitalist. It had a bad connotation. And it was really only in the 20th century that has flipped, and it has become seen as the American norm.
That is fascinating. So has capitalism always been the default economic system in the United States, or maybe it was, but under a different name? Help me out here.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so much of it depends on definition. You know, when I was in graduate school, we were taught the dominant theory said that America wasn't really always capitalist because on the one hand, you had a system of chattel slavery. And for a lot of historians, especially the big gun here was Eugene Genovese, who was the leading scholar of slavery in 60s and 70s and 80s, I would say. And his view was that slavery was pre-capitalist. And then on the other hand, you had scholars of the rural North who talked about the market revolution. And what they said was that the market revolution, which occurred in the 1820s or 1830s, was this revolutionary shock where a lot of Americans, farmers who had been living a sort of peasant-like existence, where they weren't trying to accumulate a lot, they weren't able to save a lot, cash wasn't that important because they had a subsistence economy, that this was a dramatic development. So for a lot of these people, they would say, you know, capitalism really only took root maybe in the mid-19th century. That goes against, you know, there's other scholars who say that America was born capitalist and that, you know, America never really had a medieval style feudal economy, that we always had a capitalist economy. So it kind of depends on how you're defining the term. But I guess I would say if we were always capitalist, that meant very different things in the 17th century, the 18th century, the 19th century, and today. And that it really only is in the 20th century that we've had this view of ourselves as always being capitalist. You know, my last book was on the idea of free enterprise. And, you know, one of the things I tried to show is this is a term that really comes along relatively late, really popularized during the New Deal. in the 1930s as an oppositional ideology. And one of the ways people try to justify that is they say, Americans were always believed in free enterprise, and there's a traditional free enterprise system. The Pilgrims were free enterprisers. But that's very anachronistic because no one used that term in the 17th or 18th century. People did use it in the 19th century, but really in almost the exact opposite way that we use it today. So that's one of the annoying things about interviewing historians like me is that we're always going to say it depends on how you define it or who you're talking about.
Well, look, political scientists like me, we want to turn every story into a data piece. So I'm not sure we're exactly one to cast aspersions at any other discipline. you know, yeah, you can find anything in my office, and I'm like, well, if we turn it into data, then we can measure it. I'm like,
Right.
sometimes let's just learn from the other disciplines. And so, when I think of capitalism, what I know of it from like one of my favorite authors is Ken Follett, and he
Hmm.
writes these great stories about once upon a time in England, and everything was barter. And I think about, okay, you had farming communities, and then they would trade, and foragers, they would collect stuff out in the woods, and they would trade with the farmers, and the hunters would go and they would trade. So I figure that's what people brought the early settlers, the colonialists, right? When they came here, I figured that's what they brought. But then as the political scientist, when I teach my intro class, we talk about in the Constitution, they say in Article 1 that, Congress is developed, is in charge of a currency. So I figure at some point money introduced itself and that there was currency. And so what were some of the defining characteristics, I guess, of like early American capitalism, for want of a better term for it?
Yeah. Well, I think you're exactly right. I think that, there are really multiple economies coexisting at the same time. But one of the big transformations in scholarship and history, and my colleague Ed Baptist, who I taught with, is a real key part of this. He's one of the so-called new historians of capitalism. And he wrote a book about cotton and slavery. And, you can't read his book and not think that cotton was very central to American capitalism, and the plantation owners who grew cotton were very interested in money. And one of the things he shows is they used all kinds of financial instruments that we would think as modern, oftentimes using enslaved people as collateral to create these fancy financial instruments. So, the idea that slavery and capitalism are antithetical, I think, has been blown out of the water by recent scholarship. And the other thing is that the idea that, the North, the non-slave parts of the United States were somehow not connected to slavery has also been really challenged. One of the books we taught in our class this semester was called Plantation Goods by the historian Seth Rockman at Brown University. And it's an absolutely brilliant book. And what it's about is Northern manufacturers who made goods for plantation owners to mostly for their enslaved people. Slave brogans, they were called, shoes, hose, and other kinds of equipment that were used to make, to allow enslaved people to do the work they needed to do. There was even something called Negro cloth that was sold. And so, you know, the idea that there are people outside of the market economy is increasingly challenged by scholarship than when I was in graduate school. That was much more commonly held. And what we know is that a lot of people who are in some ways outside of the market economy maybe are brought in to help make shoes that someone else is going to sell to a bigger manufacturer to sell to enslaved people. Rockman shows that in like rural New England, there would be these entrepreneurial people. They wouldn't have factories or anything like that, but they would go to their next door neighbor who might be a farmer and say, you and your family make me 20 sets of shoes by October. And eventually when I get paid for it, I'll give you some money for this. And this sort of thing happened a lot. So I think what we find is a much more maybe interdependent economy than we expect to see, very much dependent on trade, both domestic and global. And so I think that there are obviously, There's not the same kind of banking system that develops later on. There is nowhere near the technological advances that we see today. But, one of the points I think a lot of historians are making is you don't necessarily need the technology to have a division of labor, to have, people operating in sometimes distant markets and have distant customers who they're very dependent on.
It almost sounds like what you're describing are early versions of supply chains
Exactly.
that, I know I've read about merchant bankers in New England who would finance the ships or insure the ships that were part of the slave trade. But then also, I had never thought about it as something as local as a family of cobblers making shoes, which would
Exactly.
then
Yep.
be used for the sailors who are then on those ships doing this and that. And all sorts of commerce, of course. And I didn't really realize, I would have thought of our early colonial economic system as really being local, but you're telling me that, in fact, it was more interconnected than probably we may romanticize it as like the family farm and they're sewing all their own clothes. And they were doing that, but it was also probably more connected than maybe we give it
Yeah.
credit for.
There's a great book by the historian T.H. Breen about consumption in the American Revolution. I can't remember the title at the moment, but one of the things he does that's really interesting is he looks at probate records for rural people and so forth, and he finds they have English teapots or Wedgwood pottery. These are modest people, but they have these things. They want to, they would say things like, I really want to bring color into my life. So they would get dyed fabric. The dyes were from far away. And so it involved trade. Now, this wasn't an everyday, it wasn't like today when you go to Amazon or whatever, or Walmart, but it was a regular, a seasonal process. And a lot of Americans were involved in it. So if you take those things to be characteristic of capitalism, which I think are any historian would say those are some of the central components, then you'd have to say, yes, there's very early signs of capitalism in the United States, even before it becomes an independent country.
Well, it sounds then that I think it's accurate. Tell me if I'm wrong to think of capitalism as constantly evolving rather than like as a single fixed system. What you've described in the pre-Civil War era. But then we think of, of course, we can't cover all this today, but you get the Industrial Revolution, you get the Gilded Age, the New Deal. And so it seems that capitalism is constantly evolving, and how we experience it today wouldn't be how our grandparents or certainly their grandparents experienced it.
Absolutely. This is another theme we try to teach in our course. The great economist from originally from Austria, then taught at Harvard, Joseph Schumpeter, used the term creative destruction, and that's what he called capitalism. And it's very interesting because I think today we often associate supporting capitalism with being conservative politically, but his point and the point of a lot of other mid 20th century economists, especially libertarian economists, is that there's nothing conservative about capitalism precisely because it is always evolving. It's always changing. Hayek, F.A. Hayek, the great Austrian historian economist who won the Nobel Prize in 1974, I believe, he wrote a famous essay called Why I Am Not a Conservative. And the main reason he said I'm not a conservative is because I'm a capitalist. And I don't think capitalism really can coexist with conservatism because capitalism is always changing. It's always dynamic and it doesn't like traditional. It's never satisfied with what is traditional or how your parents lived. It couldn't care less how your parents lived. And I was telling my students this in the last class. Both of my parents were middle class public employees and, earning a middle class income. But one thing they had that the current generation doesn't have and probably won't ever have is really good pensions. They worked, my mom was a school teacher. My dad worked for the state of New York and, they got a certain percentage of their salary for every year that they worked. And they're still alive in their 90s and they're still getting a pension, a decent pension from jobs that they held until they were in their mid 60s. That, students are really, really surprised to hear that anyone ever had a system like that because they're very worried about how precarious their situation is and how much responsibility is on them, even in their early 20s, to begin to think about and plan for their retirement and all this stuff. So that's just kind of one example of a fundamental shift in capitalism that a lot of people don't even think about.
So you're describing the relationship between the employer and the employee. And I know my parents, at least my father for sure, he worked at a Fortune 500 company for almost all of his adult career, and that was the North Star, that you would get work, you would stay there forever, they would take care of you in retirement. And now I have a younger sister who works for a Fortune 50 company, and she is like, they have no loyalty to any of us. We
Mhm.
don't have loyalty to them. It is all a transactional relationship and nothing else. And, so I know that that relationship has changed it. And I'll ask you about another relationship, but between government, the regulators, and what we think of, I'm doing air quotes, nobody will be able to see this, capitalism. So that relationship, notably with FDR and the New Deal, but that is also always changing, right?
Very much so. I think one of the things that, again, I think we really try to teach, and this goes back to Adam Smith, who most people think of as the ideologist of free markets and the invisible hand. But Smith's whole point is that, markets are dependent on government, and that government needs to create a rule of law and enforce contracts. In other words, you need a strong state to have a capitalist economy, is his point. And so I think the idea that the state was not part of capitalism has never really been true. But the way in which the United States government, especially the federal government, has been involved has really transformed. And what we're seeing now is in some ways maybe a return to the pre-New Deal political economy, in which the government is involved, but on the side of not of workers, but on the side of business, less concerned about monopolistic practices and less concerned about regulating business than it had been for most of the 20th century.
There's so much there to unpack. I'll have you on another time to talk about the hows and whys of all of that. But I have a friend who does corporate bankruptcy, and she helps negotiate debts, who gets paid first. And she has told me many times that without the courts, the relationship corporations have with each other and investors have with corporations would be a madhouse. But that's the role of the state, is
Yep.
through the courts to negotiate those settlements and make sure that, I guess, to reduce friction. And so we kind of, if you don't appreciate that, it's like, imagine what capitalism would look like if you took away the courts.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very interesting because the my colleague in government here, and someone you may know from your field, is Suzanne Mettler. And she wrote this book called The Submerged State, which I think is one of the best books to show to students because, her point is that a lot of people don't even recognize where they benefit, where they're beneficiaries of government services and so forth. And I think the United States is maybe somewhat unique in that way, in that we have a powerful state, but nobody really knows it. And it's powerful in a way that is often hidden from ordinary people. And even the people who run it tend not to speak about it in that way. And so it creates maybe what we might call a mythology of a weak American state and of capitalism existing outside of that state.
I feel that good government is the same as a good referee. You don't notice a good referee during the game.
That's interesting because I think my view used to accord with yours, but more and more, I think just because so many Americans are cynical about government and don't think it really can do anything, I kind of think it's really important, for government to announce itself when it does helpful things. One of the things that Donald Trump has done as president, he hasn't been afraid to sign the COVID relief checks and all this stuff. And a lot of, people on the Democratic side of the aisle were very critical of him for that. But there's certainly a lot you could say about the authoritarian dangers of a president doing that sort of thing. But at the same time, I think if you did, I haven't seen the survey data, so I'm not really speaking with any authority. But my guess is more people probably knew that, that those checks were coming from the federal government that were signed by Donald Trump than other sort of things that they got. A lot of the Biden, the temporary massive expansion of the welfare state with the American Recovery Act and so forth kind of went by without people even being aware of it. And now as we have democratic backsliding and so forth, I feel like it might be necessary for government to do a better job of advertising itself, to use another capitalist term.
Right, right. Toot its own horns. So, just as a quick reminder, talking with Professor Larry Glickman of Cornell University today, and I just have a couple of questions left. We've been talking about consumers here and voters, consumers, but they're what they understand about what government does. But also, I know you've written a lot about consumer culture. So, you had a book, Buying Power: A History of Consumer Activism in America, which examined consumer culture and consumer activism. And, how did Americans come to view themselves as citizens and workers, but also as consumers?
Yeah, that was the major question I was asking in that book. And when I wrote the book, I partly wrote it because I think there had been a tendency on both the right and the left to dismiss consumers and consumption as frivolous. And I wanted to show that for a lot of Americans, consumption was one of their main ways of engaging politically. If you look at American history, women didn't get the right to vote till 1920. And, many African Americans didn't get the right to vote till the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And one of the things I found is that a lot of people in those categories, but also laborers and other kinds of activists, turn to the realm of consumption as an area where they felt they could have a more immediate impact, and also a way that you could talk about the ethics of capitalism much more forthrightly, because the whole idea of consumer activism is that we are not individuals alone in the world, but that through our purchases or through things we don't purchase, we are making a statement and having an impact. So if one of the groups I wrote about were the so-called free produce movement. These were abolitionist boycotters of slave-made goods. And they said, you may think you're an abolitionist, but if you're buying slave-made sugar, slave-made clothing, then you're really no better than someone who owns a plantation, because they wouldn't own that plantation. It wouldn't be profitable for them if you didn't pay them for these goods. And so, we continue to see that connection with people who are interested in anti-sweatshop activism, for example, or other things. We see it on the right too, where, there are boycotts of all kinds of companies because of practices that are seen as woke or whatever you want to call it. So I just wanted to show that for a lot of Americans, consumption is not frivolous, but really a way of making moral and ethical and political statements. And it's not atomistic and individualistic, although it can be those things, but also a way of bringing people together.
I was just reading a book yesterday, and one of the topics was about the backlash against ESG investing, environmentalism, sustainability governance as a marker in investments, and how there was a backlash from the conservative right about that. I
Yeah.
believe in Texas, either the governor or the attorney general told pensions in Texas, like the University of Texas system, that they could not invest. Oh, geez, I'm forgetting it now, but there were restrictions on whether or not they could use ESG as guidance, which might
Wow.
be, which I know we've gone a little afield here, but the idea is consumerism as political messaging.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I until you told me this story about the abolitionists, I never would have thought that it went back that far.
Yeah, yeah. That's one of the things I wanted to show in my book, is that I called it an American political tradition. And of course, you could take it back to the Boston Tea Party, when colonists threw tea in the Massachusetts Bay. Yeah. So it's I think it's sometimes underrated as a form of political engagement that a lot of Americans participate in, maybe because we are such a capitalistic society that we all kind of recognize there's power in the choices we make at the cash register.
This has been a wonderful conversation. I could go on hours and hours. In fact, I feel like I should audit one of your classes. I've really enjoyed this, but all good times have to come to an end. But I always like to end by encouraging listeners to continue learning after the episode is over. And you've given us lots of good recommendations, and I'll put links to all the books that you've mentioned, Edward Baptist, Suzanne Mettler's books, your books, in the show notes. If someone wanted to better understand the history of capitalism in the U.S., in addition to your own research, do you have anything that you would recommend for students who are like just starting their journey into learning about capitalism in America?
Yeah, I'll just mention two books. There are many, many more I could mention, but one is an older book by Alan Trachtenberg called The Incorporation of America. And it's about the late 19th century, a period we didn't get to talk too much about today, but about how the concept of what the corporation was really transformed in that period from a business with given special government rights because it was doing a public good, like building a bridge, to the more modern conception of it's just another way of forming a profit-making business. So that's one book I would mention. The other is by the historian Tara Hunter, and it's called To Joy My Freedom. And it's about Black domestic workers in Atlanta in the late 19th, early 20th century, and about their labor, but also their consumption practices and the way in which they tried to live dignified lives with very limited resources. It's a brilliant and beautiful book that I find students really are often surprised by and learn a lot about, a different way of thinking about capitalism.
Great recommendations. I'll be sure to include those links as well in the show notes. Once again, Professor Larry Glickman from Cornell University, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Marvin. This was I enjoyed the discussion quite a bit, and I really am glad that we had this conversation.
Thanks for listening. Really hope you enjoyed the episode. Help us reach more people by subscribing to the podcast and sharing this episode. Leave a comment too. That really helps. Thank you and have a great day.